Hey, Scott here. Today, in this video, am going to talk about cold calling. Dun, dun, dun. Something that is often the loathing of many, many salespeople out there. And it's also something that sometimes we need to do. It could be part of your initial selling process as a startup CEO. Like you want to get out there and start testing your message yourself to see if the value proposition around the problem that you solve makes sense for a particular target market. It could be something as you're ramping up and starting to scale up. And now you've got an SDR team, and you've got to turn that SDR team into a machine that is going to generate qualified leads for you. And as much as we're doing work on marketing, and as much as we're trying to do inbound leads, and as much as we're doing conferences and events and all these other things that are helping us find good leads, good sales qualified leads for our company, at the end of the day, sometimes cold calling is one of the things you just have to do. And so in this video, what I want to do is talk through a couple of key strategies when it comes to cold calling. So first thing I want to do is talk about the difference between a cold call and a warm call, or at least a minimally a cool call. The second thing I want to do is give you a really basic framework that you should use for every single cold call. Whenever you're moving into a cold call with a single person or a group of people, you want to think about there's three core areas or three core pillars of every cold call or cold call strategy or script that you're building out. And then the third thing I want to do is get really, really tactical with using some of the frameworks that I'm going to teach you here in this video by using some examples. An example from a coaching call that I just did with one of our clients. And so I'll use a really specific example from them in the example I'm going to show you. It doesn't really matter that there happen to be a fraud prevention company. What matters is how we deconstruct their approach and how you can learn to use that approach in your business regardless of what you're selling, okay? So here we go. Let me go ahead and share my little handy dandy whiteboard down below. Give me just a second. There we go. Okay, the cold call. And so the very first thing we want to do is we want to change the cold call into what we call the warm call. And by that, that's really, really simple. And it's really, really simple because in today's day and age, we can go out and get a lot of information about people before we even contact them. So even if you have a truly cold list, for example, maybe you went to an industry conference and you have a list of attendees from that conference. Perhaps you have a list that you purchased or you bought from a marketing company and you've got contact information. It could be that you've just pulled information from different websites. You could have joined an industry association. So however you may have procured a list, you've got this list and they're considered cold because they haven't heard from you. And it's also considered cold because unless you have explicit permission to market to those people, there's a chance that they've never actually heard of you before. It's one thing if somebody's on your marketing list and you're dripping to them and nurturing them. It's another thing if they actually have never, ever heard from you. And so the reason we want to change, first of all, the psychology of a cold call to a warm call is really, really simple. There's tons of information out there for most people in most markets, meaning that, number one, for every prospect or every person that you're going to be targeting, the first thing you probably want to do is head over to LinkedIn, right? Let's check out their LinkedIn profile. Let's learn a little bit about that person. Where do they work? What's their title? Where did they work previously? What are some of the topics of conversation that they're engaging in on LinkedIn? For example, are they posting on LinkedIn? You get a lot of information just by looking at somebody's LinkedIn profile. The second thing we want to do is then go to their company website, right? So in their company website, just looking more broadly, not just about the person, but looking at the company website about their products, the customers that they serve, any information that might be available. If it's for example, if it's a publicly traded company, you might be able to find, you should be able to find an annual report. So take a look at that annual report because you'll want to understand what is the key strategies for this company, not just right now, but over the next couple of years, so that as you're talking eventually about your product with these prospects, that you've got information that's relevant, that you can share relevant about your product to their company and the strategic initiatives, right? And then the third thing you want to do is go to external sources. So what I mean by that specifically is you can look at things like news feeds, news articles. So go to Google News, for example, and search that company to look for public relations or press releases that they're doing, articles about that company. You might find that there are articles specific to the problem that you solve. So in the case of the company that we're going to talk about in just a couple of minutes called Certified, they work in the fraud prevention market. So what if the company that you're calling to and the person at that company happens to be a fraud specialist? And what if that company just got hit with a big fraud attack, for example? Now you've got that information. And so just really simply, for all of the cold calls that you're doing, you want to turn those into warm calls by just doing some basic research. And so a lot of times what I used to do when I did the cold calling is I would just set a block of time, about an hour, sometimes as long as 2 hours, depending on how big my list was going to be of people I was going to call the next day. And in that block of time, it was when I would do my research. And so a lot of times it would be the night before, or it'd be first thing in the morning. I was always an early bird, so I'd get to the office pretty early. And I could spend an hour, say from 7:30 in the morning till about 8:30 in the morning, doing all of my prep work, doing all of my research, so that when it came time to call and do my call stack over, say, a 2-hour period, then it was really, really simple. I already had their name and like a link to their LinkedIn profile, a link to their company website, maybe a link to any relevant news sources, so that call by call, I didn't have to stop, do research, read a little bit, then do a call, stop, do research, do a little bit, then do a call. You're going to get into a rhythm, right? So do all of your research first, and then do all of your calling second. And that's a whole morning, right? It could be doing 20, 30, 40 cold calls, could take 2 hours, an hour or two for that research, boom, there's your day, right? So first thing you want to do, step one, is always turn the cold call into a warm call. You should know a whole heck of a lot about the person you're calling, even if they don't know a whole heck of a lot about you, okay? So the second thing we want to do is, okay, so now we pick up the phone and we start doing the calling. And so the second thing we want to do is talk through, so number one is turn the cold call into a warm call. The second thing we want to do is think about, what is the model, what is the framework that we want to use for all of our cold calls? And so the model is really, really simple. So if you think about the effect, so you've got the cold call, you're making these calls, and you're putting people into your marketing funnel. Well, what is the outcome that you want for that cold call? Now, a lot of times, as salespeople, we might have a really specific measurable outcome. It might be that we're measured on how many demos I could book, or how many next calls that I could book, or how many invitations I could send to some kind of event, right? I think most importantly, beside all of those kind of key performance indicators and all those numbers that we're trying to hit, the real outcome of any cold call is really, all we want to do is create conversation. We want to create conversation. So whether that is a conversation there in that call with somebody for 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 5 minutes or longer to learn more about their company, to see if they might be somebody who we might be able to help out and talk to, or that is setting up a next conversation, which is, look, I'm really busy, but yeah, I would love to chat more. So how about we book a call for another short conversation? However you want to define that conversation, really the goal of a cold call is to create a conversation, to get conversation going with a target prospect, right? So it could be down the road a demo, it could be inviting people to your booth, it could be some other kind of very specific measurable outcome, but really, ultimately, when you're doing your cold calls, and if you're a manager managing people that are doing cold calls, really the real outcome that we're focusing on is creating conversation, okay? So when we think about that as the outcome, there's basically 3 inputs that we want to think through when we're doing our cold calling. So the very first thing that we want to do is think about, what is the value? Use a different color here. So what is the value that we're bringing to each and every call? So when we're doing our outreach, when I call somebody and say, hey, Bill, my name's Scott, would you like to see a demo of our product? Does that add any value? No, of course not. Just like we don't like getting emails like that, or we don't like going to a conference booth and somebody saying, hello, would you like to see a demo of our product? There's no value there. And so I'm going to show you an example of how to create value in these cold calls. But this is the first and foremost, this is the number one thing that you always want to think about when you're moving into any kind of cold call strategy, is think about what kind of value are you bringing or putting into into the cold call. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, when you think about cold calling, you want to be unique. You want to be different, right? So a lot of times when we're doing our cold calling, people are not necessarily going to pick up their phone. If they do pick up the phone, then that's great. Like, obviously that's what we want. But if they don't pick up their phone, then we want to be unique enough that they remember that voicemail and that they'll pay attention to the next outreach that we're going to do. And if we do pick up the phone, then we only have a couple of seconds to make ourselves unique enough in order to buy another 30 seconds. So those first 5 to 10 seconds of the call are intended only to buy you another 30 seconds. And those first 30 seconds of the call are only intended to buy you the next either 5 minutes in that call or the next 5 or 10 minute conversation that's going to get booked for later that week or the following week, right? So number one is value, number two is unique. And the third brings us to what I was just speaking about, which is the next touch. You want to think about cold calls not as a single event or a single task. Cold call is really a verb. It's cold calling, right? And so every single cold call should be viewed as one of multiple touches that we're going to be making with any sales lead or any prospect that we're going to go after, right? So if we just think about from every cold call that we're doing, one, add value, two, be unique, three, think of it as part of a multi-touch campaign, okay? Make sense so far? Cool. So what I'm going to do is now shift into number three here, which is getting really, really tactical with how do we run these sales calls. And this is where I want to jump into an example of something that we can do with a cold call. And so the place I want to start with this is thinking about those three pillars, right? We said that there is one, we want to create value. Two, we want to be unique. And three, we want to think multi-touch. Okay. And so the example I'm going to use here is from a company called Certified. And Tom is the CEO of this company, Certified. And this is the company I mentioned at the top of this recording. Their company focuses on helping mortgage title companies avoid fraud. So it turns out there's a lot of fraud whenever you can imagine anytime there's large amounts of money getting transacted, there's always an opportunity or an opening for someone to see that as an opportunity for, cashing in on mistakes that might be made. And so that's where fraud tends to crop up. And so when I was talking to Tom, I said, okay, break down for me a little bit about how are you approaching your cold calls. One of the things that he said that I thought was really good is he said, well, look, when I'm calling somebody, then typically my opening line is something to the effect of hey, this is Tom, Tom C., I won't use his last name. I'm a large title agency owner and a creator of a company called Certified. I was calling to you because I wanted to ask you about some of the fraud trends that you might be seeing out there. And I wanted to make you aware of our product and how we might be able to help you prevent it. So just to break that down for a second, one of the things I told Tom I thought he did really well with that opening script is that he's starting with something that is valuable. So let's draw that triangle again. Use the same colors. So number one is he started with value, which is the opening line, the opening conversation piece that he talked about was about speaking to that person that he's calling about fraud trends in the marketplace. So that's an example of calling somebody and focusing on problem, not product, right? So you can think about this value creation, focus on problem, not product. Which then leads me into the second part of the script, which I said, well, this is the part where I would clean things up. So in that second part of his opening script, he said, I want to talk to you about fraud trends in the marketplace, and I want to talk to you about our product and how we might be able to help you prevent that. So what I said is, look, just cut that second part out. Let's first focus on fraud trends. Let's make that part of the conversation. Now, the second challenge now we have with that piece of script that he shared with me is that when we think about this topic we think about this topic of fraud. Dun dun dun. Fraud, very bad thing, right? The problem with a word like fraud, in whatever market problem you're solving in your marketplace, when you say, look, I'd love to talk to you about fraud trends or trends in fraud or um, in your marketplace or insert problem in your marketplace, this is kind of this big nebulous kind of problem. It's a big question, right? It's any kind of topic. If I say, let's talk about biology, well, biology is a really big topic. We could be talking about trees and plants. We could be talking about animals. We could be talking about insects. We could be talking about huge woolly mammoths. It's a really, really big topic when you're talking about biology. It's the same thing when you say, I want to talk to you about market trends in fraud. It's kind of big. It's really nebulous. It's hard for people who hear that to get their head around, like, okay, what direction, like, where's he going with this? Like, I don't really get what we're doing here. And so what we want to do is turn that opening that has the penchant for being valuable. Instead of asking a broad question, we want to get really, really specific. Really, really specific here. So getting specific, this is where I broke it down with Tom a little bit. And I said, well, look, Tom, when you think about fraud and your company thinks about fraud, how do you talk about this topic of fraud? And so a lot like you listening and watching this recording, you probably have some frameworks for how you're addressing and thinking about the market problem that you solve for your target market. And so Tom said, well, we actually think about fraud in terms of 5 vectors. There are 5 vectors to fraud. And I said, okay, so tell me more about this. So he said, well, if you think about fraud from a topical standpoint, let me just erase this stuff. Just redraw it. So we take this topic of fraud and we actually define it in 5 vectors, which I thought was a really interesting word. This word vector. It's unique. It's unique. This is important. So first of all, this word vector is not a word that we use pretty commonly. So if I hear it, as soon as he said, I think about fraud in terms of 5 vectors, my ears, I'm like, vectors. I never thought about measuring fraud in terms of vectors, right? So I said, all right, Tom, what are the 5 vectors by which you're thinking about fraud? And so he said, okay, it's really easy. Like number 1 is we look at what he called spoof portals. And this is the part where I'm going to talk about his company and his problem and his product. I want you to think about your problem that you're solving and how you approach your problem in your market, and what's the wording or the nomenclature or the language that you use in your marketplace for your customers with your product, right? So he talked about spoof portals. Number 2, he talked about spoof statements. Number 3, he said the third vector of fraud is, he called them borrower payoffs. And I've been in the mortgage industry, and even some of this stuff I didn't understand, which is kind of the point, is that he's framing the conversation in a way because he is the expert, just like you are the expert in the market problem that you solve. The fourth thing that he looks up is third-party payoffs. That's another vector. And up a little bit. Payoffs. And the 5th vector he called payoff trolling. Payoff trolling. So I said, okay, this is a really, really great start to go from this big nebulous topic of fraud to something really, really narrow. So I said, okay, Tom, for your marketplace, of these 5 vectors, which of these are either the most important, which of the ones are kind of top of mind for most of the people? Are there any that are more new versus old? And he said, well, yeah, actually this whole this payoff trolling is kind of a new form of fraud that we've only seen pop up in the last 60 to 90 days. It's because fraudsters are getting more and more sophisticated, and so they're able to hack into certain systems and look for when transactions are happening. So they're trolling for when that money is moving from one place to another, and they're trying to grab that money. And so they're just the level of sophistication that people have gotten. This is kind of a new sort of fraud. And that's also leading to some spoof statements getting created as a way to actually collect that money. And he said the other fraud types, these are ones that most people kind of think about most commonly, but the other ones, the payoff trolling and the spoof statements, are the ones that are most kind of the new ones on the block, the new fraudsters on the block. So I said, perfect, perfect. So again, think about your company and the frameworks that you use to describe the market problem that you solve. Think about what is the one or two that are most specific, because what we want to do by generating value in this cold call early on and making it unique is ask a really specific question. So if we rewind and go back to Tom's script, where he said, hey, I'd love to talk to you about fraud trends in the market, we want to turn that from broad and wide to really, really specific. So in his case, what we said is, hey, this is Tom. I'm the CEO over at Certified, and our company does a lot of work around mortgage fraud. The reason I'm calling you is that over the last 60 to 90 days, we're seeing a huge upswing in mortgage fraud, specifically what we call payoff trolling. And the reason I was giving you a call is because I wanted to find out if you're seeing this in your transactions. See the difference there? That's a really specific question. And it allows them to leverage the uniqueness of this specific vector of how they think about fraud. So when I get that call, that's a very different call than, hey, this is Scott. I'm calling from Certified. We help companies like you prevent mortgage fraud. I would like to talk to you about your mortgage fraud situations and if you would like to see a demo of our product. Like, nope, not interested. People aren't interested in that. You ask a specific question that gets them thinking, like payoff trolling. Wait a minute, payoff trolling? I don't even know what that is. What do you mean by payoff trolling? Oh, well, payoff trolling is actually it's a pretty new form of fraud that we're seeing in the marketplace. Let me explain what payoff trolling is. Payoff trolling is this and this and this. And like I said, this is kind of a new layer of fraud, and wondering if you're experiencing that in your marketplace. What you've done is you've completely repositioned the conversation. This is supposed to be a cold call about sales, and now you're actually diving into really specific conversation about mortgage fraud. So this is all about the product, not all about the problem, not the product. And so through that specific question, that is what's going to help you generate conversation. And from there, you can say, if somebody says, for example, like, oh, actually, we don't experience that at all, then you could follow up and say, oh, that's pretty interesting. It's one of the 5 vectors of fraud that we've been tracking and that we measure. And so wondering if maybe you see some of the other 4 vectors in mortgage fraud. And again, it's unique, that word vector. We don't use that very much in our common language. So if I'm on the other side of that call and I'm getting that, I'm hearing that from somebody like, oh, there's 5 vectors to fraud. I didn't know that. Like, what are the other 4? Well, there's spoof portals, there's spoof payments, there's borrower payoffs, and there's third-party payoffs, in addition to the payoff trolling I just mentioned. Now you have framed the entire conversation. One, you framed it, you're the expert because you're teaching somebody. You're getting them to say, wow, I never thought about fraud that way. I didn't know there were these 5 vectors. I just knew fraud was a problem. I didn't categorize it this way. And I certainly didn't even know that there was this thing as payoff trolling. And secondly, you framed the discussion around these 5 vectors, which play really nicely into the way that their product is built. That's what they do, is they help monitor all 5 of these. And so through that conversation, through that being specific with a question, following up with something unique, talking about these 5 vectors, you've reframed the conversation about the problem, not the product, and you've been able to frame the conversation in a way that you're in control of where the conversation goes, right? So this brings us to the third piece, which is multi-touch. So a lot of times you might hear, you'll get voicemail, right? Or you'll get somebody who says, look, I can't really talk right now, but send me an email. Sounds interesting, send me an email. Or you actually engage in a conversation with somebody and they bring up like, oh, this has been really useful actually. So what exactly do you guys do? Right? Get them to talk about the product. Well, here at Certified, we have a mortgage prevention a mortgage fraud prevention platform. It's designed to, in real time scope out and look for these 5 vectors of fraud so that you can completely alleviate the time and energy it takes to look for fraud, as well as reduce fraud down to 0 at your business. Cool. How does it work? Well, I'd be happy to show you a demo of the product. When would be a good time to show it to you? Are you available next Thursday? Or I would love, what I should do, if you want to see a version of the product, the best person for you to talk to would be Lynn, who runs all of our customer implementations. She's really great. She knows a lot of stuff about fraud, and she can show you our product and how it might work for your company. So what I've done, if I'm the CEO, I'm Tom, the CEO doing the cold call, I can refer, when it turns into a sales conversation, I'm now moving that conversation over to my salesperson. So I remain the authority, and I stay genuine to the reason that I'm calling that person in the first place, which is, look, I'm just calling to see if you've seen an uptick in the amount of payoff trolling in the transactions that you're managing. And secondly, now you started to create a multi-touch strategy with this person. You've now created, you ultimately got to the goal of conversation. Right? Does that make sense? So when we think about this, so now we've effectively created the system that we want. We've created value. We've been unique. And thirdly, we will now talk about how to actually run your multi-touch campaign with your with the leads that you're managing, right? Because a lot of times you're going to get voicemail, right? So let's talk about that for a second. There we go. Okay, got a new screen. So let's dive into this multi-touch strategy within the framework of cold calling, or as we know to call it, warm calling, multi-touch. So huge fan of starting with the phone, because most people start with email, and everybody gets a lot of emails. And even if you write really, really good emails, it's really, really hard to cut through the noise. So I would suggest starting, if you're doing your outbounds, I would always start with the phone. Always start with the phone, okay? So I'm just going to draw a couple of touches here. In this way, we can build out your multi-touch campaign. So the first touch we're going to do, we said, is phone. And we just talked through how to run that call. If somebody does pick up the phone and you do talk to them, now you've got that conversation going, and hopefully it'll lead into the next conversation. Usually what happens when we call people is we get voicemail. And we also know that not a lot of people listen to voicemails, and certainly the people that do listen to voicemails, not a lot of people are necessarily going to take that message, take down your number, and then call you back just because you asked them. And this is where the multi-touch becomes really, really, really important as an effective kind of campaign around cold calling. It's not a cold call. The cold call is one piece of a multi-touch campaign. So in that call, when you leave that voicemail, one of the things we want to do is build a bridge to the next touch. And so typically that next touch is going to be an email that you're going to send. So if you get voicemail, the message would be something like this. Hey, John, this is Tom over at Certified. I'm the CEO of the company. I'm doing a lot of work around the mortgage fraud space. And the reason I was calling you is that we've been seeing an uptick in the amount of payoff trolling that is occurring in the marketplace. And I wanted to find out if, in fact, you're seeing that in your local market. I was wondering if you could give me a call back. My number is blah, 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 blah. As a quick follow-up, I'm going to shoot you an email. And if it's just easier for you to reply back to the email, that'd be great too. So that last little piece is giving yourself permission to take that next step. It's giving yourself permission to follow up. So then in the email, it's the same thing. You're keeping the email really short. Hey, John, just left you a voicemail. The reason I was calling is doing a lot of research and around mortgage fraud across the 5 vectors of mortgage fraud that we're seeing in the marketplace, particularly we're seeing an uptick in one of those vectors in the payoff. What do we call it? Just, oops. Called it getting some goofiness here. Okay, got it figured out. Seeing an uptick in the amount of payoff trolling in particular. And I wanted to ask you a couple of quick questions about the payoff trolling activity you might be seeing in your area. Oh, by the way, if I don't hear back from you, I'll try to catch you on the phone later this week. So again, you're building a bridge with your permission, giving yourself permission to follow up. So you could run this multi-touch in a couple of ways. You could do phone, then email, then phone. You could say first voicemail is, look, sorry, I missed you. Here's my number. If I don't hear back, I'll try you back in a couple of days. I'll try you back on Friday. Then you do the second message. And the second attempt, maybe you get them, maybe you don't. If you don't, then after the second message, then you then say, look, I'm going to send you an email. It might be easier if I just send you a quick email. So you insert maybe 2 phone calls here in between. So it's phone, then email. You think about, you can test this, see what works best for you. Ultimately, what we're doing here is creating a multi-touch campaign where within a very short period of time, 5 to 7 days, you can do 4, 5, 6 touches really, really quickly. And so if you run this loop really quickly, so maybe it's phone, email, maybe you have one more touch here. Not everybody's going to get back to you, right? Some people just ignore your email. Some people never call you back, obviously. So what we want to do is think about how can we extend this conversation or this attempt for a conversation. And so the next thing we want to do is look at another place to have a touch with people, and that's social, right? So on social, you could connect with them on LinkedIn, right? You could follow their company on LinkedIn. What else could you do? You could go to their website. You could sign up for their mailing list. So you sign up for their mailing list, right? Something else you could do, right? If you see a post that they've done, if you see them on LinkedIn, then you could like or share or comment on a LinkedIn post. So even though you're the one doing all the work, you've now done an effective multi-touch campaign, right? And then finally, if you're still not getting any traction, then the last thing you want to do, and this will get into more of a marketing funnel, which is then invite them to some kind of event. So for example, if you're doing an executive briefing, or you're doing a webinar, maybe you've got a larger event, you're hosting a workshop, or you're going to be at a conference and you're going to be speaking, or you're doing a breakout session, something like that, then the next thing is like, hey, sorry we haven't been able to catch up. I did want to let you know that next week we're going to be running an executive briefing. We're going to be talking about the 5 vectors of fraud in the mortgage industry. So, we got a couple seats left, a couple spots left if you'd like to join us, right? Or, hey, we're going to be at the blah, blah conference next month. Sorry we haven't been able to catch up by phone or email here, but if you're available, if you've got some spots, if you're going to be going to that conference and you've got some spots open in your calendar, maybe we can find 15 minutes to catch up there. So what you've done here is you push them over to an event where, again, you're in control of the problem and how you're framing it. And the other thing you could do, aside from an event, if you don't have an event coming up, a second option for you would be move them into a content piece. So what I mean by that is have for example, in the case of Certified, they have a white paper that they're writing around these 5 vectors. So it could be a white paper, could be a previous webinar that you have recorded. Maybe you've got an ebook. Whatever that content piece is, hey, John, sorry we haven't been able to catch up. Thanks so much for your time. Anyway, in the meantime, I wanted to let you know that we're going to be publishing a white paper around the 5 vectors of fraud management. Would you like me to send you a copy? Always ask them. which requires engagement. So, would you like me to send you a copy, or send you a link, or send you a copy of the recording, right? And so when they say yes, great. You know what you do there? Let's bring it over here so I have a little more space. That's where you bring them to the landing page. And in order to get a copy of the recording or to download, a copy of the book, and guess what they have to do? They have to share their email address. And when they share their email address, what does that do? It puts them into your marketing list. And now, even though you haven't been able to connect with that person through this initial cold call outreach, you've done multiple touches: phone, email, social. You've invited them to an event, and you've given them an opportunity to get onto your marketing list. And through that marketing work that's happening, that's the nurturing, that even if right now you're trying to hit them with this cold call in this moment, in this week, maybe this week is just not the right time. However, getting them onto your list allows them to learn more about what you do, so that maybe next week or next month or next quarter or next year, because they've been nurtured through your marketing, they will be at a point where they will raise their hand and then perhaps opt in to a call, right? So all of this happens because you've built a multi-touch campaign around your cold call, okay? So when you think about cold calling, I just want to go back to what we're covering here. One, it's never a cold call. It should always be a warm call. Research people on LinkedIn, research their company, read as much as you can, look for news, look for sources, look for information about that company. Number two, when you make the call, think in terms of value, think in terms of being unique, and think in terms of multi-touch, with the true output or the outcome of any cold call strategy should just be create conversation. And then number three, when you're actually doing the call, follow this strategy so that when you do pick up the phone, the value is created through specific questions that position you as the expert around this problem, using unique language, using unique questions, and opening the door for a much more sophisticated, much more cerebral conversation. And then finally, the fourth thing that we want to make sure that you do is think about multi-touch as part of a much broader campaign where it's phone, email, then social. Maybe social is sprinkled in somewhere in between, doesn't have to be at the end of the campaign. And then at the end of that cold calling campaign, the 4, 5, 6, 7 touches that you do, make sure you have an opportunity to invite them to an event, or at a minimum, get them an opportunity to download some content so that they move into their marketing list and that you have official permission to then market and nurture to them. All of that just because you know how to cold call the right way. So, so that's it. That's the gist of what we covered in the coaching call. And I wanted to share it with you because it was just too good to leave into the ephemeral atmosphere. So it didn't get recorded when we talked with Tom and his team, and I wanted to make sure to share it with you because I think this is too critical. Whether you're doing, the cold calls yourself as a CEO, or you have a team of people and you're trying to come up with the right strategy for cold calling, this is the model that you want to follow. This is the strategy you want to follow. And if you do this, I think you're going to see much better conversations with much better clients, and you're going to see a much better long-term effect of the cold calling because you've got a strategy to get those people into your marketing nurture through this multi-touch and long-term marketing campaign. Okay. So that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. As always, if you have any questions, let me know, and we'll pick it up from there. All right. This is Scott, and I'm signing off.